And I want to thank real quick our sponsor, Build Equinox. They manufacture the CERV smart ventilation system right in central Illinois in a 100% solar-powered facility, being verified as a zero-energy facility. The CERV is the first smart ventilation system for residents with active monitoring and control of indoor air quality, measuring carbon dioxide and total volatile organic compounds, VOCs. With the CRV's IAQ sensors, filtered fresh air is delivered to your client's home when they need it the most. CRV saves energy with efficient heat pump energy exchange technology. Not only that, this allows the CRV to actively heat or cool and dehumidify incoming fresh air. This makes the serve ideal for any climate, whether hot or cold. All right, well, welcome everybody to the impacts of storing solar energy in the home to reduce a reliance on the utility and grid. This course is approved for 1 hour in continuing education units, the main ones AIA, HSW, and GBCI. Today I'll be your moderator. My name is Brett Little, and I'm the Executive Director here at the Green Home Institute. Green Home Institute is a nonprofit with a mission to empower people to make healthier and more sustainable choices in the renovation and construction of the places we live. So the impacts of storing solar energy in the home to reduce reliance on the utility is our course today, and I'm real excited to introduce you to Robert Ferris. He is an AAAS Science and Technology Policy Fellow at the U.S. Department of Energy Building Technologies Office, working in the Emerging Technologies Program. His current focus is on the potential for building sensors and controls to reduce energy consumption and provide services to the electric grid. Dr. Ferris is a mechanical engineer with a background in thermal fluid sciences and energy systems, and he earned his PhD and master's in mechanical engineering from the University of Texas at Austin, where he developed methods to model and optimize the operations of battery energy storage used on the electric grid in order to understand their economic and environmental trade-offs. All right, so with that, I will hand it over to Robert and take it away.
Thanks a lot, Brett, and thank you everyone for being here. It's really great to be able to share this work that I had published recently with Dr. Michael Weber from the University of Texas at Austin. And so, you know, this slide here shows the title of the paper and also the DOI, which if you type that into any web browser, you should be able to get quick access to the paper. There is a paywall. But if you're at a university or know someone at a university, they should be able to access it. And so this paper will have all the details of the work I'm going to present here today. But I think we'll be able to get through all of our main findings, and I'll give you a peek of kind of how we did the analysis. And so hopefully you'll have a good understanding of the paper just from the presentation. But of course, the paper is there as a reference document. And of course, a quick disclaimer, now that I am a fellow at the U.S. Department of Energy, is all the views that any views that I'm expressing in this presentation are my own and don't necessarily reflect the views of the U.S. Department of Energy. And all this work was completed while I was still a postdoctoral fellow at the University of Texas at Austin. And so I always like to begin presentations with my key findings rather than bearing the conclusions at the end. And so our key findings from this study was that home energy storage can significantly reduce power flows between a home with solar panels and the local distribution grid. I mean, this is a good thing because it can really help reduce some of the investments the utility might have to make, not only to integrate solar, but just their routine investments that they're making in order to make sure that energy can be delivered during peak hours. However, the power flexibility that storage provides comes with an energy cost, and that's because some energy is consumed every time the storage charges and discharges. And so that's a concept called round-trip efficiency, which we'll cover later on in the presentation. And so when we analyzed this extra energy consumption based on the Texas grid mix, we also found that that would lead to a net increase in emissions, thinking about the way that all the power plants on the grid would actually change in order to cover that extra energy consumed by the battery. And then if you're looking at the economic basis for storage, we found that storage really only provides a benefit if it's used for this application of solar self-consumption, which I'm going to talk about in the presentation. If the price that the utility is going to pay you for your solar energy is a lot lower than your consumption tariff. And so in Texas, the most you can get for your battery is about $100 per kilowatt hour. And so that means the battery price would have to fall below that in order to make it economical for consumers. And right now, those prices are a lot higher, closer to around $700, $750 per kilowatt hour for the kind of the cheapest system you can get today in terms of all-in costs. All right, and so now that I've walked through our key findings, let me talk about how we got there. So I'll begin by talking about home energy storage, how it works, the recent trends in the industry. And then I'll discuss how we modeled a home battery system in order to understand how it would operate and what its impacts would be on the rest of the grid system. And then I'll walk through the findings that I touched on about the energy cost and emissions impacts of using energy storage to store solar energy in the home. And then finally, I'll conclude with some closing thoughts and talk about some of the implications of this work. And I do want to leave plenty of time for questions and discussion, so I'm sure we'll have some time at the end. All right, so just as a brief review of the way that solar panels interconnect with the grid today is basically they kind of use the grid, as some people call it, a free battery, where power from the grid is used to make up for shortfalls in solar generation and also to absorb excess solar generation. And so for a typical home from the study we did, which was based on households in a greenbelt neighborhood that's monitored by this entity called Pecan Street Incorporated, which some of you might be familiar with, part of a smart grid study. But for those typical homes, usually, of course, in the evening and at night, they're not producing any solar energy. They're getting all their electricity from the grid. And then as the sun rises, their solar generation increases, eventually about matches their total demand. And then in the middle of the day, usually because people are at work, the solar will actually exceed their house's consumption. And that energy will be fed either to nearby houses on the same kind of on the same side of the transformer as those homes, or fed elsewhere in the distribution grid to nearby homes. But it's all generally balanced by the wider grid system, which of course has a lot of large generators that can easily compensate for that level of intermittency from a small rooftop solar system. And so, of course, that does come with some additional costs. And so you kind of need to, I alluded to this before, you need kind of the grid capacity in order to deal with that intermittency. And especially as solar panels become more common and other forms of renewable energy become more common, there are concerns about the issues associated with this variability and intermittency of renewable resources. And so there's been growing interest in using storage within a building in order to consume solar energy when the total solar produced is greater than the household's demand from the grid, and then discharge once the solar begins to decline. And so typically what happens is, I refer to the middle of the day period where solar is exceeding a household's total consumption. And so in that case, the battery would charge, and then the people come home, they're coming home from work. This is typically when demand peaks in Texas. They're turning on their air conditioner, as you have to do most of the year. I'm sure it's very hot there right now. I'm in Washington, D.C. currently, fortunately, really, but considering the summer comes so early in Texas. But, and so in this case, the battery would discharge to cover that increasing demand, and that helps kind of alleviate the peak, and it also helps alleviate some of the issues associated with feeding energy back into the grid. And so this is kind of the concept behind this application, which is often called solar self-consumption, where you're basically just making it so that rather than using the grid as a battery, you're consuming more of your solar energy in your own home. And of course, this I don't really have to even stress this point, but this isn't a conceptual thing anymore. This is something that's really happening. And so really, since Elon Musk and Tesla unveiled their Powerwall battery, the idea of storing your solar energy in your own home battery system has become this very mainstream popular idea. And it was kind of a funny thing for me personally, where I started doing research on energy storage used on the grid and with renewables back in 2010. And back then, people, if you said grid energy storage, they were often thinking about pumped hydro or compressed air energy storage, basically non-battery forms of energy. And the idea of using a lithium-ion battery for storage was pretty foreign to most people, and they didn't really think that it was something that was practical. Whereas now, if I mention that I'm a storage researcher, people immediately like, oh, you mean like Tesla's Powerwall? And then they basically want to talk my ear off about it, which is really a weird experience. considering, usually I think I was boring people when I was talking about storage back in the day. And so, Tesla saw huge numbers of reservations for their Powerwall not long after they announced it. And then a couple of companies and utilities, and this information is somewhat dated now. This is from back in 2016, but there's stories every day on the internet about the growth of home storage and the Powerwall in particular. And why is this appealing to consumers? I mean, really the main selling point that a number of these home storage companies are offering to consumers, at least for the first entrance into the market, is being able to rely less on the traditional utility. And so, they want, consumers want to be able to store their solar energy so they can use it at night, so they can, go net zero or rely on the utility as little as possible. And they also want the benefit of being able to provide power to their house when the utility's grid isn't there, when there's an outage. And ordinarily your solar panels wouldn't be able to provide power because they don't have the balancing aspect of the grid that I discussed previously. When you've got your battery there, that can actually provide backup power for a pretty significant amount of time. And so customers that can afford it, they really want to use as much of their own electricity as possible. And this is compounded by the fact, and I'll talk about the economic impacts later, of course, but this is compounded by the fact that as you have net metering kind of transitioning out and lower rates being paid for your produced solar energy, batteries are a way of kind of doing what you might call artificial net metering, where rather than sending that to the utility and taking whatever they're going to pay for your solar energy, you can just keep it and use it for yourself. And so this is something that's really becoming appealing to consumers. But, I want to stress this point where it's something that is really appealing to consumers. There's clear reasons why they might want to purchase storage. But traditionally, consumers really haven't needed storage to install solar, and that's a good thing because that means that there really isn't a technical need to store your solar energy in order to install solar panels. And so I'm going to show a couple of pieces of data that kind of show that from a high level, and then I'm also going to talk about some details of kind of methods of integrating solar energy without storage that people are looking at for the case of Germany, where they're far beyond the US right now in terms of their solar penetration. And so if we look back at 2011, and this is kind of the point where the DOE has the most authoritative data for the amount of energy storage installed, the total rooftop solar capacity installed in the US was about 2,500 megawatts, and the total battery energy storage capacity was only 108 megawatts. And this includes a lot of storage that's typically used back in 2011 was really used for backup power for substations and some grid applications like that. And so when you look at that ratio, it's pretty clear that at least in 2011, there was a very small amount of storage required for integrating that solar. These numbers are obviously really dated, but they're kind of relying on the last comprehensive energy storage inventory that the DOE did. Another good example, slightly more recent, is if we look at SEC filings from SolarCity, we can see that SolarCity is a company that leases solar panels to customers. They had a total balance of about $3.3 billion of solar panels leased to their customers, and they only had about $4.9 million worth of storage leased to those customers. And so this shows us for the vast majority of those SolarCity customers, they're not going to need storage installed with their solar panels in order to deal with any of the intermittency issues associated with solar. And so, like I mentioned, this is a really good thing because it makes solar overall more affordable because you don't need to buy a battery in order to enable interconnection. And then getting more on the technical side and maybe looking to the future, there's been some great research coming out of Germany looking at different methods to integrate solar panels into the distribution grid without storage. Because storage is, of course, very expensive, but those prices are going down, of course. And so this is a great paper that I'm citing here, and this is from IEEE Power and Energy Magazine, which is great because it tends to be a lot more accessible than their technical journals. And so I've got the URL and the DOI here for this, and so if you want to take a look at that later, I would recommend it. This is a great resource. But basically what they did is they looked at 5 different strategies that you could use in order to integrate solar panels with a distribution feeder. And so they looked at, basically like limiting the total power output of the PVs to 70% of their installed capacity. That's kind of a brute force method. And then they looked at a few different methods involving smart inverters, where that's basically where the inverter, which is the device that converts the solar panel's DC electricity to AC electricity, which today basically kind of operates for the most part in a pretty dumb way where, I mean, not dumb, but I mean, it's totally static in that it's basically trying to maximize the output of the solar panels and make the power factor, which is a term for the balance between reactive power and real power, which will affect the voltage on the distribution feeder. It's a term for the balance between those two. And so it's trying to make it so that you're getting all real power and no reactive power. But if you play with that ratio, that's something that you can do to really mitigate a lot of the voltage issues associated with integrating solar panels. And so they looked at, well, what if we use, rather than these basic inverters, what if we make them more dynamic and use smart inverters? And they also looked at basically a transformer upgrade where you're having a dynamic transformer that says OLTC, that's an on-load tap changing transformer, which is basically monitoring the voltage on the distribution grid in the same way, kind of reacting and changing its resistance to affect the voltage on the feeder. And so, the point is they found that, and then, well, they compared all of these more advanced strategies to just grid reinforcement, which is building out the grid, putting in new wires, thicker cables, new transformer, something that's going to be able to handle the solar. And so the costs for all of these are relatively modest, and you can see the cost for all the strategies except for that brute force strategy A that I mentioned are a lot cheaper than even grid reinforcement, which is what they're typically doing in Germany today. And this is for an entire distribution feeder. I don't have the actual number of buildings in this graph on it, but it's pretty large, and they're getting to 72% installed PV capacity compared to the initial capacity at a relatively moderate cost of a few thousand euros. And there's a similar study that I don't have cited directly here, but maybe I can have Brett email it out. Well, looked at California, and they did a big modeling study using data from PG&E and Solar City, and they found that by basically increasing the number of transformer tap change operations, PG&E could get to about 100% solar penetration. And that's the way that's measured is based on the nameplate capacity of all the solar panels divided by the utility's median peak load. It's kind of confusing, but basically a lot of solar, and the increase in cost from the transformer tap changing operations was like a vanishingly small part of the utility's total operation and maintenance budget. And so there's a lot of, they're not free, but they're relatively economical ways to change the way the grid operates in order to integrate solar. I know I'm getting a little bit into the weeds here. So turning back to our study, the whole point was that we know there's a lot of different methods to integrate solar panels. We know that traditionally storage hasn't been required to integrate these solar panels. And so we really think it's worth taking a critical view to evaluating what the real impacts of adding home energy storage to households is. So how is that going to affect customers' bills? How is it going to affect their total energy consumption? To what extent does it really change the power flows on the distribution grid? And then when you look at upstream and think about the actual impacts on the dispatch of generators, how is it going to change your emissions? And so that was the goal of our study. And so in order to do that, we really needed 3 different pieces of information because it's really not a very straightforward question. So we need to know, when do households use and generate electricity? And this is really important because how storage is going to respond in order to try and keep as much energy as possible within that's produced from the solar panels and store that and then use it to cover the home's load is directly dependent on when the solar panels produce and when the house uses electricity and how those two are aligned in time. And so we needed a lot of data on when households use and generate electricity. And then we also needed to know, well, what are the capabilities of the home energy storage system? What's its power capacity? That's how quickly can it discharge or charge in kilowatts. What's its energy capacity? That's its total energy storage capacity in kilowatt hours. And what's its efficiency? Its round trip efficiency. And that's basically equal to if you get, say you put 1 kilowatt hour of energy into a battery, you never get 1 kilowatt hour back. You always get a little bit less. And so for the case where you get 0.9 kilowatt hours back, that would be equivalent to a 90% round trip efficiency because you get 90% of the energy you put into the battery back out. And then we also need to know, well, now that we know when customers are using energy and producing energy and we know the capabilities of the storage, well, how can we model how storage would really operate in order to try and minimize reliance on the utility through this solar self-consumption function? And so let me walk through kind of how we did all this. So I mentioned this before, but fortunately we had a partnership between the University of Texas at Austin and this nonprofit organization, Pecan Street Incorporated, which, shameless plug for the DOE, Pecan Street was really kickstarted by a Department of Energy Smart Grid Demonstration Program grant of about $10 million, and since then has been really successful in terms of bringing really unprecedented insights into the way consumers use electricity in their homes. And so they've been monitoring a number of households for several years using kind of advanced home energy monitoring technologies that can record solar generation and whole home consumption on a 1-minute basis. And so this is a lot more fine-grained than you're going to get from a smart meter or certainly from a traditional utility meter. And so we have this data for 99 different households and for the entirety of the year 2014 because we started this study back in mid-2015. And so this shows you a sample of the data where in this case it's January, so the customers aren't using their air conditioning, and this home has gas heat. And so, they've got some pretty low cycling, probably associated with maybe a water heater, maybe a refrigerator in their use, which is that red curve throughout most of the day. And then the solar generation is shown by the green curve, and that's negative in the middle of the day, indicating that the house is actually producing energy. And it's very intermittent and kind of peaky, and that's because this is a January day. It's probably pretty cloudy. And the net curve, that's just the total consumption minus the solar generation. And so in that case, that kind of shows the home is a net consumer most of the time. In the middle of the day, even with this peaky solar, is a net producer around noon. And, we have this data for a number of different households. And so I'll just cycle through a few different households for the same day, January. And so we can see households really use energy and even produce energy at very different times, depending on the exact orientation of their solar panels, the alignment of clouds with their solar panels and shading, et cetera. And so, here's a couple more houses showing their solar generation, their consumption, and their net for January. And we also have this data for the entire year, as I mentioned. And so I'll cycle through a couple different months so you can see how the time of year can affect this. And so this is the same house that I showed, the first house that I showed for January. But on this April day, we can see it was less cloudy, got a nice, little bit more of a bell shape to your solar energy. It's still pretty peaky. That's indicating that there's some clouds. And also, I mentioned how hot it gets in Austin. You can see the air conditioner is starting to cycle on around a little after 3 p.m., which isn't uncommon. And then moving into July, we see, of course, a lot more of that air conditioner coming on. Even, given the fact that there's no air conditioning running in the morning is pretty impressive. So clearly this person is trying to reduce their air conditioning use. But we also see the solar is a lot more of a pretty bell curve, less of those peaks. And so that's indicating kind of a hot summer day without a lot of clouds. And now moving into October, similar story, nice clear solar bell curve, not too many clouds, and very low consumption in this case for the most part. With the exception of maybe some air conditioning or other maybe space heating activity later in the evening. So the point is the way that consumers use energy and produce solar can vary a lot. And the fact that we have this data for 99 households for an entire year allows us to really account for that variability in the way different consumers use and produce energy so that we can understand what the aggregate impact of storage would be on the grid. And so now moving on to the specifications for the battery. And so fortunately, we were able to get these based on the Tesla Powerwall. Tesla is very transparent about this, more transparent than most companies out there in terms of actually providing their kilowatt hour, kilowatt capability, and their round trip efficiency, which is really important. And so this is based on the Powerwall 1. Now there's the Powerwall 2 out there, but as I mentioned, we started this study back in 2016. And so this model is a 7 kilowatt hour system energy capacity. It has a power capacity of 3.3 kilowatts, and its DC round trip efficiency is 92%. And so I mentioned, an inverter, which is used for converting a solar panel's DC electricity into AC electricity suitable for the grid. You have to do the same thing for a battery system. And so that, that means that we had to convert the DC to DC round trip efficiency provided by Tesla to an AC to AC round trip efficiency. And so to do that, we assumed, you can see that second line up, that the AC to DC conversion efficiency was equal to the DC to AC conversion efficiency for the inverter, and that's equal to about 96%. And that's a pretty standard number that's used for these inverters. And so when we multiply that through, we get a total AC to AC round trip efficiency of 85%, meaning if you're going to put in 1 kilowatt hour of alternating current electricity into this battery, you're going to get about 0.85 kilowatt hours back. But I will show how the results change if we change that efficiency later on in the presentation. And then finally, we need to understand, how will storage really operate? And so we decided to consider 2 different ways that storage might operate, which kind of operate as bookends on the kind of range of possibilities for this solar self-consumption application. So we use one that we call target zero, where the storage just naively charges whenever the home is a net producer and discharges whenever it's consuming, and it's not really worried about, if it's going to run out of energy later in the day and maybe miss the peak or anything like that. It's just if the house is a net producer, it's going to charge if it can and try and zero out the home's production, and if it's a net consumer, it's going to discharge and it's going to try and zero out the home's draw from the grid. And then minimize power, so this is kind of the other end of the spectrum. And so this is where the storage has perfect day-ahead foresight. It knows exactly what the solar output's going to be, exactly what the house's electric load is going to be, and it kind of works really strategically to minimize the power drawn from and injected to the grid over the entire day. And so to give you an idea of what these look like, let's look back at some of these data from these households that I showed before. And so, if we're looking at target zero, it's just going to try and zero out demand completely. And so if we add the battery on top of this, if you really want to look at the net curve here. So if we look at the net line, like I mentioned, as soon as the solar is available, that battery is zeroing out that home's net demand by just charging and discharging exactly when it has to in order to make the net draw from the grid and the net injections to the grid equal to zero. But that does lead to some peakiness later on in the evening because the battery wasn't really concerned about those peaks. So minimized power is, like I mentioned, has perfect foresight. And so if we look back at the same household in this case, it charges in a similar way and discharges in a similar way. But what it does is it doesn't discharge all of its energy to completely zero out the home's demand when the solar is producing. Instead, it just keeps it really, really low so that it can try and keep the demand a little lower than the peaks into the evening. And so you can see you've got a small positive power demand over the whole day. And so this kind of shows the difference between these 2 different methods. And just showing that explicitly here, this shows kind of the net curves for minimized power and target zero for this household. And like I mentioned, we've got lots of data for lots of houses, lots of different days. And so when we apply these 2 operational methods, we see sometimes very minor differences. So in this case, you've got a really tiny charging current on the minimized power one in order to avoid that power injection that occurs right at the end of the solar production point around 3 p.m. here under target zero, but they're about the same. And they're just cycling through a few other days. I think you all get the point here. Often they're very similar, but just in general, minimized power is going to try and flatten demand, whereas target zero is trying to zero it out, but then might miss the peaks. One more day here, just showing some of the differences between the way the 2 algorithms operate. So the whole point is, I mentioned this before, is, we picked these operational methods because they're distinct, but they're also pretty similar. And so they kind of show 2 different ways that a real storage device might operate in order to maximize self-consumption and try and reduce interactions between a home and the utility. And so they're different in terms of that one has no foresight, one has perfect foresight. One's really concerned about being independent right now, doesn't worry about later, whereas the other one is concerned about being independent now and later at all times. And then, if you're looking from a billing perspective, not many residential customers have demand charges right now, but that is something that's being discussed in the future for customers with solar energy. And so minimized power would be really the sort of operation you'd have if you were worried about minimizing your demand charges, whereas target zero is more concerned about avoiding your energy charges. It's just trying to keep as much of your solar energy produced in the home as possible. And so, as I mentioned before, we just applied these algorithms to the data from all those 99 households, and that allows us to account for variations in solar system size and their household electricity demand and the ratio between those two, and also account for differences in the timing of when your load occurs versus when your solar generation occurs. And so now, without further ado, I'll walk through our actual quantitative results that I gave you a peek of at the beginning of the presentation. And so I'll begin by looking at electricity demand. And so this is looking at to what extent home energy storage can reduce the power flows in the distribution grid. And so this figure shows in gray, that's the net power demand, total load minus solar generation of all of the 99 households put together if they're not using storage at all. And so, as you'd expect in the spring, it's relatively sunny in the spring, but demand is low, and so you're going to see your peak solar injections there, really pretty significant ones that persist even into the summer. I think when people often think in the summer that you're going to be, running your air conditioner and using your solar energy and not even sending that much to the grid, we still see a pretty significant injection of energy into the grid without storage. And then, in the same way, you've got your peak demand occurring around late August, which is typically when it occurs in Texas, and that's, driven by your air conditioning. And the solar, notably, isn't really doing a whole lot to reduce that demand because you still got a pretty big peak demand for just 99 households of about, that would be something like 3 or 4 kilowatts per home if you were to average it. And so, then in blue, that shows what happens if you add storage and kind of balance out the solar with the load under the target zero approach. And then finally, the red is the storage under minimized power. And so if we actually quantify the differences in the peaks and the injections, peak demand and peak injections, target zero does a pretty good job in the summer, but it's still on your worst case scenario days, it's not really going to change your peak injections and your peak demand that much. And so from the utility perspective, target zero probably wouldn't be very appealing. But minimized power in this case, because it has that foresight, really significantly reduces the peak injections of solar energy and peak demand by 42% and 32% respectively. And so this is something that, I think a lot of folks from utilities might look at this and find this really appealing, because this is one of their #1 issues associated with paying for the grid and paying for generators is this peak demand issue. And so to the extent storage can minimize that, it's definitely something that's appealing. But, as I mentioned before, the power flexibility, which is great that storage provides, does have this cost associated with the extra energy that's consumed. In this case, you're only going to get 85% of the energy you put into the battery back out. And so what we did is we plotted the change in energy consumption for each of the 99 households using a histogram. And so basically, we binned the change in energy consumption from adding storage to a household with solar panels into 50 kilowatt hour increments. And the height of each one of these bars indicates the number of households that fell into each bin. And so, what this graph shows is that there was a lot more clustering for the target zero households than there was for the minimized power ones. And that in general, minimized power, that kind of more utility-centric, demand-centric operation, it's a little bit more dynamic, involves more charging and discharging, which leads to more energy consumption. And then so what we did is we took the average for each one of these, and then we did something called a student's t-test on this data. And so basically what that does is it says, well, what if we kept growing our sample beyond 99 homes? And so say we expanded this to the kind of several hundred or nearing 1,000 homes that Pecan Street is monitoring today, for example. How much would we expect that mean to change? And so the student's t-test tells us that there's a 95% chance that the mean would fall within those gray ranges indicated here. And so, the point is that depending on how storage is operating, it's going to be increasing a household's energy consumption by about 324. That's the low end of the gray bar for target zero, to about 591, which is the high end of minimized power. So about 324 to 591 kilowatt hours increase annually. And to put this in perspective, according to EIA, a typical single-family home uses something on the order of 1,100 kilowatt hours a month. And so this is somewhere, between about, 1 to 2 weeks of electricity consumption for your typical home. So pretty significant. And that's just, all based on the energy, you can kind of think about it as a storage device is a machine that runs on energy that gives you power flexibility. And that power flexibility is valuable, but there is an energy cost. And so we were able to quantify that for an average home. And then, the next aspect is the economic impacts. So I alluded to this before, but now we're going to dig into it in a little bit more detail. And so this can be really complicated because there are all sorts of different ways that utilities will credit customers for solar energy. And so we analyzed the cost impacts of storage under 14 different electricity tariffs. So we looked at a lot of Texas tariffs. We got Austin Energy, which is where these homes are actually located. In that case, they pay you a fixed value of solar tariff. And that's it's shown for all the utilities under approximate feed-in tariff. That's the cents per kilowatt hour the utility is going to pay you for your solar. And then the consumption tariff is the cents per kilowatt hour that they're going to charge you for using energy. And so we considered 7 different Texas utilities, including Austin Energy and San Antonio, which are regulated, vertically integrated utilities. They're grandfathered in because they're municipal utilities. Whereas the other utilities I have listed there, those are competitive retail electric providers in Texas and under the deregulated market. So MP2 Energy and TXU Energy are competitive retailers, and then Encore and CenterPoint shown there, those are regulated wires companies. And so we consider different combinations of wires companies and retailers. But the table shows what they're going to pay you for your solar energy and what they're going to charge you for your consumption. And then just as a theoretical exercise, we considered some utilities in Hawaii and California. Both of these are places where they're adding a lot of solar, and notably in Hawaii, they have rates which, if you look at the 10-year present value of storage in Hawaii, they're pretty attractive to storage right now. And that's because they're really having a lot of issues associated with their solar integration in their grid. But of course, these are just for illustration only because customers would use and generate electricity differently if they lived in California or Hawaii than they do in Texas from the homes that we sampled. And so a couple of highlights here. In general, storage provides a pretty significant amount of value when the consumption tariff is higher than the feed-in tariff. And so in Texas, the greatest benefit came under the MP2 Energy one, and that's where they're only going to pay you about 3.6 cents for your consumption. That's basically a market rate for the price of electricity, but they're charging you almost 9 cents. And so you can really save a lot by avoiding drawing energy from the utility by storing your solar, and then you're also avoiding selling it at a low price. And so basically your margin is going to be about the 5 cents difference between those two. And then, in Hawaii, I mentioned before, there's some pretty big deltas between the feed-in tariff and the consumption tariff, and so that can be pretty valuable. And then notably, from the places that we looked at where they have traditional net energy metering, and so this is where the consumption tariff and the feed-in tariff are exactly the same. In this case, because of the extra energy that's consumed by solar, storage is always a loser economically, and so it's costing you money. It's something pretty interesting. Of course, those net energy metering rates are something that are probably going to go away for the most part soon, and storage maybe can be something to help mitigate some of those economic issues. But if you're under a net metering tariff, storage really isn't going to do a lot for you economically. And then just to highlight, if we're looking at Texas, so this is the most realistic case because, as I mentioned before, the households that in our sample come from Texas. Storage would have to fall below about $100 a kilowatt hour for it to be valuable. And in Hawaii, it could make it if it were about $300 per kilowatt hour. But of course, that's just theoretical because households would use and generate energy differently there. And as I mentioned before, storage today is about $750 a kilowatt hour, so it's still pretty expensive. Still pretty far from being economical in this application. All right, so now the next thing we analyzed was the emissions impact. So we knew that storage, it changes when the households draw energy from the grid. It also changes the total amount of energy that they draw from the grid. And so what we wanted to know was, well, what are the emissions impacts of that? Is it maybe going to reduce the use of your peaking combustion turbines by shifting the peak, as I showed in my first graphs of the power demand, and then maybe shift more generation to natural gas combined cycle, which has a lot lower emissions than those combustion turbines? Or maybe is it going to be shifting, natural gas and replacing it with coal? And this is something that the grid is a very complex system, and so let me kind of walk through how we estimated what the real impacts would be. And so what we did is we used something called marginal emissions factors that some researchers had calculated for the Texas electricity system. And basically what they did is they used EPA data. EPA has the continuous emissions monitoring system. So they used data collected from EPA for every power plant in Texas's ERCOT zone, which is basically the Texas grid. ERCOT stands for the Electric Reliability Council of Texas. They got all those generators and they said, okay, well, if demand changes by a megawatt hour, how does, that's shown in your delta generation on the x-axis for each of these, how do the emissions change? And they analyzed using regression, okay, well, what, based on, at different levels of demand, what is the associated change in total emissions for a given change in total generation? And so this is shown for different levels of fossil generation online, which is a proxy for system demand. What the marginal emissions factor is, so what's the change in emissions associated with the change in generation at various levels of demand. And so what this shows is that when demand is lowest, your SO2 emissions and CO2 emissions are going to be highest. That makes sense because coal is traditionally, especially when these data were taken, which was I think between 2002 and 2012. So they're somewhat dated now, but they do span the period where natural gas prices plummeted. And natural gas became more of a base load generator. But anyways, your CO2 and SO2 are going to be very high when you have low demand because coal tends to be on the margin. That means it tends to be responding to changes in electricity demand, ramping up and down slightly. And then your NOx emissions are low and pretty flat most of the time until you get to very high periods of demand. And so this is where your combustion turbines tend to be on the margin, where when demand is reasonably high, you're going to have most of your flexibility is provided by these combustion turbines. So they'll be ramping up and down in order to match those changes in demand. And the neat part about this analysis is that it doesn't depend on modeling of individual generators. It just looks at the actual emissions that occurred at actual levels of total demand. And so it's empirical rather than analytical in that they don't have to model the whole Texas grid, which is a really complicated exercise. They just have to look at what happened. And so they get a reasonably accurate estimate of emissions. And so what we did is we converted these to hourly data. And so this shows the CO2 emissions on an hourly basis, a lot lower in the spring and fall when you're going to have low load, or sorry, a lot higher. And then same with SO2, a lot higher in the spring and in the fall when you've got lower load, lower in the summer when you've got more combustion turbines. And of course, the NOx is the opposite. It's really high in the summer because that's when you've got your natural gas combustion turbines responding to changes in demand. And so, going back for a second here, the point is we had the hourly load curve basically for a home with storage installed for both target zero and minimized power. And so we could just multiply that through and compare it to what the home's load curve looks like without storage, with only solar panels. And so that allowed us to understand, well, what's the increase in emissions associated with adding that energy storage? And so what we found was that for CO2 emissions, the total emissions went up for every household. As you might expect, because you've got more energy consumption due to inefficiencies under minimized power, the CO2 emissions were higher under minimized power than they were for target zero. And we did the same students t-test to get an idea of the range, and we found that emissions would go up by about 150 to 300 kilograms per household. But really what's important here is the concept that emissions are going to go up for your average storage device, at least based on the current Texas grid mix. And then interestingly, when we look at SO2, this kind of shows you how the way that storage changes when homes draw power from the grid can actually decrease emissions for some households. So if you look at some of those bars lying to the left of the zero mark there, you've got a fair number of households, like a few dozen households, that are actually seeing a decrease in their SO2 emissions footprint because of when they generate and when they use energy, and the way that the storage is responding to that. But when we look on an average basis, the SO2 emissions still do go up on average. And so they go up by about 0.03 to 0.20 kilograms per household. And this basically indicates that in general, you're probably having a shift away from natural gas and toward coal in the way that the storage is operating, which kind of makes sense because coal is traditionally your cheapest generator. It's going to be your baseload generator, and natural gas will be slightly more expensive. And so by reducing your demand or reducing your peak demand and providing less solar energy to the grid, essentially in the middle of the day when demand is relatively low, you're shifting your generation toward coal. And then similar story for the NOx, where there's a handful of households where their NOx emissions could go down, and that's likely because of the reduction during peak, as I mentioned, shifting away from those combustion turbines. But due to the extra energy consumption caused from the storage, the NOx emissions do go up on average for if we consider all the households as a block. And so the average increase was about 0.04 to 0.26 kilograms per household. And once again, the more dynamic, minimized power, demand-centric method of operating led to more emissions. And so I just want to stress, I touched on this a few times, but emissions are increasing for two different reasons. So one is because the extra energy consumption that storage is causing due to its inefficiencies. But it's also because energy storage is changing the temporal nature of each household's net electricity demand. And so if you just think about the house as the grid operator doesn't know what's in the house. It's either a house with solar or it's a house with solar and storage. The solar and storage house is going to be drawing power from the grid and injecting power to the grid at different times of day. And so that's going to change the dispatch of generators. And so what we wanted to know was, well, how does changing the energy storage efficiency affect these emissions? So at what point could storage provide an emissions benefit? How efficient does it have to get? And so we did this analysis for both their target zero operation and minimized power. And we found that, because of the way that the storage is shifting when generation occurs, it could actually reduce SO2 and NOx emissions even if it's only 90% efficient under the target zero method of operation. Even though storage, of course, would still be consuming some extra energy because it's not 100% efficient. And then under minimized power, interestingly there, NOx emissions couldn't go down even if the storage were 100% efficient, but your SO2 emissions could be decreased on average if you reach about 95% efficiency. And just to stress in general now, 85% is around that's like a top of the line storage device, and it's pretty hard to exceed that because you have if we look at Tesla's Powerwall, they quote the DC to DC efficiency of 92%, and that includes losses for liquid thermal controls that they have in there. So they have a cooling system to make sure the battery doesn't get too hot, because that's going to make it degrade really fast. And so you have energy losses associated with the actual battery conversion process itself. That's storing energy. You've got losses associated with your cooling equipment to make sure the battery doesn't get too hot, and you've got losses associated with your inverter. And so it's pretty hard to get those losses, close to 100%, really above 90%. But of course, that doesn't mean people shouldn't try. And so I think that maybe we'll see some storage devices with higher efficiencies coming out. And also I should mention that lithium really is the most efficient battery device that's used out there today. So if you look at something like a flow battery, I don't know if anyone's familiar with that. A flow battery is like a large scale battery storage device that some people are interested in using for grid applications. That's going to be closer to about 70%. And so storage efficiency can certainly get a lot lower than it is today. All right. So now that I've walked through all of my results, let me just kind of wrap up with some conclusions. And so, I hope by now that you all understand that home storage can really significantly reduce the magnitude of power flows between a household and utility. And this is a good thing because it can offset the need for additional generation capacity to meet peak demand. It can also really reduce the amount of distribution capacity that's required to serve these households, help offset some of those grid reinforcement costs that I showed from the case of Germany that people have to do not only to integrate solar, but also just to deal with load growth, deal with aging distribution infrastructure. And so that's a good thing for the utility. But home energy storage consumes energy in exchange for the power flexibility it provides. It's a machine that runs on energy that provides power flexibility. And so adding energy storage to a home, at least under the current Texas grid, with solar panels, or the storage alone, does lead to an increase in energy consumption and CO2 emissions, SO2 emissions, and NOx emissions versus a household with only solar panels. So energy storage energy storage would increase a customer's electric bill under conventional net metering tariffs, and it'd have to get to about $100 a kilowatt hour to provide a benefit under current Texas tariffs. But the fact that storage can provide this service that's good for the utility, that's reducing those power flows in the distribution grid, means that perhaps storage could be part of a, you could have a new utility business model that makes energy storage appealing for customers, and that also kind of helps mitigate some of those issues associated with integrating solar energy. And so today, residential customers, and this is indicated by the fact that you had a higher benefit for the customer from target zero operation than minimized power. Residential customers don't have a direct incentive to reduce their demand. But if the utility were to meter and bill electric demand, that would create an incentive for home storage, and it might help make the total cost of solar plus storage a little bit cheaper. And then I really want to stress this point. I mentioned this a few times, but don't forget, solar and storage is cleaner than no solar at all. And so I kind of look at this as, you might call it a rebound effect. That's not really a correct term. That's used for, rebound effect would be like, I buy a more efficient fridge and then I put my old inefficient fridge in my garage to keep beer in or something like that. And then, now I'm using the energy consumption of an old fridge and the efficient fridge. And so that's called the rebound effect in energy efficiency speak. But you can kind of think about it this way, where if I'm adding storage with my solar panels, you're going to have a little bit of a energy and emissions cost associated with that. And so you really should only be adding storage if it's the only way you can add your solar panels, because you're still going to be a net winner there when it comes to reducing your energy consumption. But if you can do the solar panels without the storage, that's really preferable, especially if it's the most economic option for you. And then this just shows the same data. So this is a waterfall chart showing the reduction in CO2 emissions from adding the solar, and then the increase under the two different operational methods we showed. And I do want to stress that as adoption of solar panels increases, there could actually be cases where you can't add solar without the addition of storage. And so we're really seeing this in Hawaii today, where the Hawaii Public Utilities Commission, they recently capped new rooftop solar interconnection requests, but they don't limit solar interconnection under something called a self-supply tariff. And so this is basically where you are not allowed to backfeed energy into the grid. You must consume all of your own solar energy, and then they will let you interconnect your solar panels. And so this is where the utility is strictly requiring you to use storage, basically. And so that's a clear example of where storage is going to enable you to install solar panels in the first place. So you'd be better off, of course, with solar and storage than just relying on the grid. But at the same time, I really want to stress that Hawaii is a really unique case. It's not really indicative of the rest of the United States. They have very high electricity prices, something like 35 cents a kilowatt hour, whereas the US average is something like 12 cents. And then they also have a lot of sunlight, and solar is cheap, and that's made a lot of people want to install solar panels in order to avoid those very high electricity prices. And with everyone installing solar panels, that's causing them issues because they have a really small grid, just a couple of generators, and they have no access to power from outside the state. Whereas here, if we're looking at a place like California, and the duck curve issue, which some of you may have heard of, where they're having too much solar in the middle of the day and too little during peak times, that's something that California can mitigate by connecting building transmission between California and the rest of the Western United States. And that's something that Hawaii simply does not have that option, because it is literally an island in the middle of the Pacific Ocean. All right. Well, now I'm going to wrap up and make some time for questions. But before I do that, I do want to acknowledge Dr. Michael Weber, who was my co-author on this work, helped me a lot with it. And then also Dr. Ross Baldick, who's a professor in electrical engineering at UT Austin, who provided a lot of advice and guidance. And then finally, my old research group, the Weber Energy Group, and then the Energy Institute, Pecan Street Incorporated, who I mentioned, and the Electric Reliability Council of Texas, all of which provided the funding for this research. All right, well, that's it, and I'm happy to take questions now, so I think Brett's going to help moderate those.
Yeah, thanks, Robert. We got some questions piling in. I've got my own questions here. Before we get to those questions, Well, looks like we're missing a slide here, but that doesn't matter. For those of you as the questions are piling in here, for those of you listening live, a survey will be sent out to you when you close this out. The same survey will be sent to your email. Make sure to check that, and then all your CEU reporting instructions will be in there. And again, just a huge thanks to all of our sponsors: Panasonic Ventilation, Build Equinox, Pleo Tint, Certainty Air Renew. All of our members, our board of directors, we certainly couldn't do this work without you. So yeah, several questions piling in here. Is there any prototype program for reimbursement to grid-connected battery residents for cycle life used by the grid?
Yes. So I'm not totally up to speed on all the programs that are out there, and this is a very fast-moving space. But one notable example is in Vermont. The utility there, I think it's Green Mountain Power. They've had a pretty strong partnership with Tesla, and so they're actually deploying these batteries and giving people pretty heavy incentives to install these batteries. And they're controlling those and dispatching them in order to reduce the utility's peak. And I don't know exactly how the cost share works between like how much the customers pay for the battery versus how much the utility pays for the battery, but I believe the main benefit that they're offering to customers in this case is not only the subsidy for the battery, but also that the customers would have the capability to operate as an isolated entity if the distribution grid were to go down. So they'd have the backup power from that battery, and then in exchange, the utility is aggregating them and controlling them. And I should point out, we looked at this very customer-centric application where the customer is basically, they're not controlling the battery, but the battery is controlled with their interests in mind. Another way that you'd operate home storage is where you would aggregate all of it and basically have the utility operate it, and it'd probably be facing the electricity market directly, essentially, in order to reduce power procurement costs for the utility. And the reason we didn't analyze that is because there actually is a great paper already out that looked at, well, what are the emissions impact of storage playing in the electricity markets? And they found similar results where emissions go up unless the storage is like 100% efficient. And maybe I can send that to Brett and he can send that around. But that's by another storage researcher named Eric Hittinger, and he does a lot of great work in this area too.
Great, thanks. And just to confirm for everybody, and this is a question, when you say emissions go up, you mean compared to with PV only, but not if you didn't have PV before, correct?
Yes, and so that's shown explicitly in those waterfall graphs. And that's just acknowledging the fact that we need to be cognizant of the emissions impact of storage alone in thinking about how we structure rates and policies associated with decarbonization, because we need to know that unless storage is directly enabling renewables, it can have this negative impact that we might not anticipate.
So the other question is, if installing storage through PV causes emissions to increase, can we adjust the ways we generate electricity on the grid with new designs and with lower emissions based on new usage patterns?
Yeah, so definitely. I mean, that's so there's two different issues that are in that question, really. So one is usage patterns, which I'd say I'm kind of interpreting that as when you use electricity, and one is when generation occurs, so that the generation can align with renewables. And so both of those are great strategies that indicate kind of ways that you can integrate renewables without needing storage. Because like I mentioned, storage is an energy consumer, not an energy producer. And so it's really, it's a load and not necessarily something you want when it comes to integrating renewables. And maybe this is another paper I can send to Brett, but there's a great paper that came out of MIT that looked at how basically storage's role in decarbonization and how much storage is required. And they actually compared two different cases, one where you have flexible nuclear available and one where you don't. And that's really interesting because, nuclear is one of these things where people think that it has to run at the same output 24 hours a day. But in a place like France, where they get a huge amount of their electricity from nuclear, they actually will load follow with their nuclear plants. So they're ramping those plants up and down in order to balance load. And so that's something where in this paper they looked pretty critically at the trade-offs between storage for renewables versus having a flexible nuclear for renewables, which is a totally carbon-free method of flexibility that can help mitigate some of these issues associated with aligning solar with load. Another, clear example of that is hydro, where hydro is actually the most flexible large-scale generation technology there is because it operates at room temperature. So you don't have any of these thermodynamic issues. I mean, not really thermal dynamic issues associated with heating up and cooling down this big power plant. You can just kind of let water out of the dam at whatever rate you need in order to balance renewables. But of course, the second order impact of that is how much water you have in the dam is a limitation on you. And so if you don't have enough water in the dam, you're not going to be able to necessarily provide power when you have to. And if you have too much, you might be, providing too much power when your solar is generating, for example. And then the second side of that you mentioned is usage patterns. So that's also a huge thing. And so that's a lot of the work I'm doing at the Building Technologies office now is how can we make loads more flexible so that they're aligning with when people are using energy. And in making them more flexible, often you can also make it so their total kilowatt hours they're drawing goes down too. And so in that case, it's kind of the opposite of storage. You're getting your kilowatt flexibility by maybe, making your water heater smart, but you're also reducing your kilowatt hours because maybe your water heater now knows, oh, they're not home. I'm going to reduce my temperature set point so that I don't have to use as much electricity. And so by enabling these flexible loads, you can align usage with renewables and also maybe reduce your kilowatt hours, which is a good thing.
Keeping on that note, a lot of conversation is happening, and a lot of building scientists are pointing to the idea that we need to start fuel switching and going all electric, especially up here in the cold weather climate states.
Yeah.
Moving away from natural gas, propane, oil, for health reasons, for safety reasons, and perhaps for energy efficiency reasons. How does that play a role in some of this study if people are starting to switch over and electrify more? Does that really change anything or alter anything?
Yeah, I mean, it definitely changes things, and that's something. I mean, I think that the big similarities between this study and the electrification movements is I think that you really need to think about how is my changing when I'm drawing electricity, maybe significantly increasing that by shifting your natural gas heating to electric heating. What's happening on the electric grid when I do that? And you really can't make any assumptions about that. I mean, it's a pretty sophisticated machine if you think about the grid, and it's really important to model those impacts and think about them critically because I think that we often have this sort of fallacy where it's because I can't see the emissions, electricity seems very clean when you're using it, right? Because you're not seeing any of those emissions, but that doesn't mean that they're not happening further up the supply chain. And so I'd say with these electrification studies, and actually, with these electrification studies, it's really important to think about the upstream impacts really critically. And so I'll bring up one example, and this example certainly isn't illustrative of the electrification push that's going out right now. But if you think about a resistive heater, which is really kind of this is the reason it's not illustrative, is that a resistive heater is basically your most inefficient electric heating source you might use, right? But a resistive heater converts electricity to heat, and it's something above 90% efficient. So that sounds efficient, right? But if you're looking at a natural gas power plant powering that, it's your most efficient natural gas power plant is going to be about 60% efficient. That's the best you can do. And so that means you're getting your natural gas, you're throwing 40% of that energy away, you're shipping the electricity over power lines, they're going to lose you about 5%. And then by the time it gets to the house, you're losing another 5% in your resistive heater, whereas you could have just burned the natural gas on site and maybe lost about 10%. In the efficiency of your furnace. And so that's an example where, like I said, resistive heaters are kind of the worst case scenario. Ideally, you'd be using a heat pump, which does have the potential to use less energy and produce less emissions than your natural gas power plant example. But that really depends on what the end use is and what generators are, how the generation dispatch is changing based on when you're drawing energy from the grid. And it's a complicated question, and we never know exactly which electron is traveling to an end use device. You really need to think about the grid as a system, like I did in this study, by looking at marginal emission factors and other kind of system-wide metrics.
Can you briefly talk about how this might be able to apply to commercial or multifamily buildings?
Yeah, so that's a really good point. And so, we focused on residential mostly because we had the data for these residential buildings. But, I talked about the demand charge issue. And so most commercial customers, they're actually billed they're billed for demand, and they're billed for the maximum kilowatts they draw from the grid over the entire month. And they're billed at a pretty high rate. And so I'd say there are a lot more cases where solar plus storage is going to be economically viable for commercial customers because of this demand charge issue. Because if you're adding your solar and say it tends to peak at about 2 p.m., but your building is still drawing its peak amount of power at around like 5 or 6 as people are starting to leave work or something like that, then that solar is not going to do a lot to reduce your peak demand. But if you add some storage and you can shift that solar production to another time of day, you can really significantly reduce your demand charges. And so I know there's some work that's done at NREL looking at kind of energy management for federal buildings, actually. And they're finding that there are a lot of cases where storage plus solar is going to provide a better bang for your buck than just solar alone. And actually, that better bang for your buck allows you to add more solar panels economically. And so that's another case where storage might directly enable adding more renewables to a commercial building in order to by increasing the economics basically. And so that actually might directly enable renewables. And so that's a case where the battery would be a good thing.
Great, Robert. Well, that's all the questions we have. That's all the time we have for today. I really appreciate your time with us. I appreciate everyone for joining us here. And just real quick, before we wrap up, where can people go to find more information if they want to learn more?
So you can go to the paper. You can go to my blog that I write for, scientificamerican.com. Plugged In is the name of the blog. And I think you can continue listening to, there's a lot of good podcasts out there. So I mentioned to Brett, I did actually talk through this whole presentation and this paper with Green Tech Media's Interchange podcast. And so I think Brett's going to send the link out to that. It is past a paywall, unfortunately, but for those of you, I imagine there might be a couple of you on the line who are paid members to Green Tech Media, then you can listen to me talk through this with them for about 45 minutes. So lots more to talk about.
All right. Thank you, Robert. Thanks, everyone. Everyone have a good week. Take care.
Thanks.